Well, thank you very much. Let me just check here. Okay, we're all set. Well, it is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very appreciative that so many of you have stuck around with the threats hanging over us this week of ever leaving Brest. Well, actually, I have a little bit of a love for this place, Brest. It's you know, it sticks out in the Atlantic Ocean in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense, except that there's the ocean there. You know, if you look historically, and well, why does that matter? Because I'm from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in a place that sticks out into the Atlantic in a way that doesn't make much sense, except for history and fisheries in particular, I must say. So yeah, coming back to Brest here is a real pleasure. In fact, I pushed the button. Any hint here? The right-hand button? This one. Here's a good friend who will fix this for me.
I will. Eventually, please.
While we're waiting, you can enjoy a nice picture of Stonington, Maine, in New England, United States, which one of those wonderful places that I'm going to talk about today that combines together a love for the ocean with a spirit of conservation of the ocean as well. And I'll come back to this, not particularly Stonington, but other places as we go along. Thank you. Merci. First, a celebration. I just want to take a moment to celebrate this event this week. When I was coming here, I was reading through the this list of organizers and scientific committee, the local organizing committee. I was getting a little nervous. Then I looked at the attendance list of people just coming to this conference and got more nervous. This is an amazing effort, this conference, and an amazing collection of people. I want to particularly note, well, actually, I came in early today and I saw David, Olivier, and Jason hard at work this morning, and of course they're at the top of the masthead, and deservingly so. But the whole list of organizers is very impressive here. One in particular that I just want to point to, it's getting very dark in here. Denis Bailly here in Brest. Don't know, can't see if you're out there, Denis, but Denis and I worked together with within IFIT, the International Institute of Fisheries, Economics and Trade, many years ago, to set up a socio-economics network within IFIT. And the idea was to link in the people side of things more so than perhaps conventional economics was doing at the time. And I'd like to think that that's kick-started a bit of a broadening of that particular group. So that now we have strange things happening at IFIT, like, for example, Eddie Allison convening a session on poverty issues in fisheries, and some aspects that just wouldn't have happened some time ago. But just to celebrate this a little bit more, I was saying to Jason this morning that there are some meetings in the ocean realm that get referred to into the future. You know, that people are referring to the Reykjavik conference on ecosystem approach in fisheries even now, even though it's quite a time ago. And I think this meeting might be one of those. So I'm very grateful to be here and speaking to you. And I'm just going to take a moment to wake you up and invite you to celebrate the organizers of this meeting and the sponsors, ICES and others. Really a wonderful effort. So just a little applause for those folks. Well, that's about all I have for today. I I want to start off with this word transdisciplinarity that others have mentioned. Eddie Ellison in particular talked about that yesterday, and I was realizing with the definition that he was giving that I've been struggling with being a transdisciplinary researcher for quite a while now, and some of this talk is going to reflect that. In particular, transcending disciplines, but also that idea of engaging with civil society, engaging with ocean users, and so on. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I was reflecting back on my own personal timeline. I'm actually a mathematician by training, but I have, as you might see in this talk, kind of evolved over time. Still have a bit of a passion for modeling, actually, but I've moved into other areas as well. And in a sense, one of those time periods that really kick-started a shift for me was the collapse of the cod fishery just off the coast, a couple of kilometers from where I live in Halifax in Canada in the early 1990s. And that's almost 25 years ago now. But seeing the impact on coastal communities, on people, 40,000 people put out of work across the Atlantic coast of Canada, and seeing the impact on communities, but also looking at the resilience of communities in bouncing back, in trying new things, in shaping their future, led me to look more and more at that side of ocean use. And then along that time, Christina, in her kind introduction, mentioned I was dealing in the early 2000s with something called the Ocean Management Research Network in Canada, basically a cross-Canada effort to get linkages of the people side. Our Canadian government recognized that they don't really have internally expertise on the human side of ocean use, and the idea was to connect up academics with government people around the research on human uses of the ocean, which reminds me a little bit of some themes of this conference. So I wanted to start off with a few little points that come up on the transdisciplinary front. So, some points I guess I've learned over time. And I am going to focus largely in this talk, as I'm meant to do, on, from the title anyway, on aspects of integration and aspects of participation. But first I just want to reflect a little bit on those of us that are actually involved in this field. The first point I want to mention is that we need to know what we don't know, each of us individually. And I think that's crucial in a transdisciplinary sense, that we're connecting up disciplines, but there's no one among us that really has that deep knowledge of those disciplines when we're pulling things together. I should say we have knowledge of particular disciplines perhaps, but not of all disciplines. And as we're transcending that, we recognize, I guess, that we can learn as we go, and I was just talking to Phil Levin about this earlier. We learn as we go, but we also are needing to recognize what we actually don't know as we go along. Because we are behind, in a sense, on integrating the human side into the whole picture of ocean use, we need to kickstart that to some extent. It takes years to develop that knowledge base, so we need mechanisms, institutions like this conference that bring people together across the disciplines, across their backgrounds. And I'm going to skip over a couple points here, but the fact is that some catching up is needed in building up that linkage. I wanted to put down there in blue a reminder of some aspects that Eddie Ellison raised yesterday: power, ethnicity, gender, ethics, and institutions as areas that probably need more attention, actually studying these aspects. And for me, although I was never much of a historian in my education, I've come to appreciate the importance of understanding history, of understanding the experiences that have come before. And there was some points coming up over the course of the conference from from the young researchers here about careers, transdisciplinary careers. And I was struck by that discussion yesterday, actually, that it's a tough point because, you know, if there's one failure I've seen in universities over the course of my time, is the shift, the broad-based shift into interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary structures in the universities. It's like the quote that was mentioned about problems, the world having problems, but universities having departments. That wouldn't be such an issue. Nothing wrong with departments per se. It's the silos that cause the problems within that setting. So there's no easy answer, but I think coming away from this conference with a passion for integration and a passion for transcending disciplines will really serve people throughout their careers. So it's not an automatic job situation, but it's, I think, an inspiring situation to have that transdisciplinary approach. Now, from an institutional point of view, sort of broadening out from that, there are some very interesting, I guess, conflicts or contrasts in terms of how we see that integration side of things, whether it's linking disciplines or how we set up a structure that brings especially the human dimensions more fully into the consideration, or if you want to put it in a more neutral sense, how do we achieve the balance of all the different aspects within the system? I'm not going to go into each of these aspects. This is just my perception, I guess, that this ranges from those who want to avoid bringing the human dimensions in, or at least limiting to a scientific analysis, to those that look at human dimensions as part of the people process in decision-making, to fully bringing in the recognition that the human goals and human components are actually needed in the analysis and in the decision-making. And this is where some of the research aspects on the human side of things, so from law, from policy, from sociology, anthropology, economics as well, the research aspects need to come in more into the decision-making. So not just the process aspects, but both are needed there. I'd like to turn to systems for a moment. And this conference has a theme on socio-ecological or social ecological systems, and I find myself adopting that jargon a fair bit. Earlier in the week, Serge Garcia mentioned an article I wrote just over 20 years ago in a very nice journal, Aquatic Living Resources, that some in France here in particular might be familiar with, but others, and a nice international journal called Fishery Science, the Study of Fishery Systems. And I was trying to make the point there that in a sense we are all broadly looking at fishery systems, and that was fishery focused. I'm going to try in this talk not to fixate on the fishery side of things, but many of us do have that as our background. But the systems idea has been around a long time. When this book of mine came out 15 years ago now, I had a comment from a colleague of mine in Canada that, well, isn't that systems idea just already so passé? You know, systems is, well, you know, it's just a way of looking at things. It's not really at the core. That was in the early 2000s, and you know, soon after that, the idea of social ecological systems has taken off more broadly, well beyond the fishery and ocean side of things. But I do, you know, highlight that social ecological systems is just one jargon term for systems approaches. They've been around for a long time. I mean, certainly before my work, systems had been, some of you are familiar with IASA in Austria, the Systems Analysis Center. Systems thinking has been around for a very long time. So to me, the important thing is the system and not the jargon, not the terminology, but the system from an integrated point of view. So some of the themes that I personally have worked with in terms of a systems perspective are shown in the pretty little boxes here. Everything from governance to well-being to adaptation to communities. And I'm going to talk about some of these themes today. But I wanted to start with back where I first got involved in thinking about a systems approach. Started very simply with taking a natural resource and some fishing boats and combining that into resource extraction, and it goes to market. So, the quintessential bioeconomic thinking would be along this line, at its essence. But if you broaden that out, and this is a diagram I've found useful over the years, but there's many different ways of depicting a system. We have all these interactions between different components, and that's obviously, for those who are ecologists here, that's the idea of an ecosystem. But similarly, on the human side, we can look at systems of interacting components. Serge Garcia mentioned some work that he and I did earlier in the 2000s, several years ago now, and I just wanted to highlight two particular diagrams that are both his diagrams. They're in the paper, so I'm going to claim a little bit of the right to show them, but these are really from Serge Garcia. A beautiful, and I'm not going to go through these again, but a beautiful time frame of the expansion, the development of models over time, and the complexity that comes with them. So complexity on the x-axis, time on the y-axis here, and the evolution over time of a whole range of models, particularly on the fishery and more on the natural system side. And a diagram I particularly find useful that shows a system that includes really all the kind of the stuff, to use a technical term, that we would talk about in ocean use. Everything from the analytical process and the participatory process, linking together the integrated assessment aspect in the middle here, and right through to the policy, and of course iterations with arrows, feedback, the feedback aspect all the way through there. And then we have to remember that when we're talking about oceans, we have a whole range of drivers. And those drivers, we might think of climate change, but we also should be thinking of technological change. Back at the time of the cod collapse, one of the fishing people that I was working with was suggesting that technological change that wasn't noticed by the scientists or the managers, that was basically what he as a fisherman was doing with the technology, was actually at the root of that cod fishery collapse. So he blamed technological change in particular. Now I want to shift quickly to another basic concept that I think we're probably all familiar with. So I'm just going to briefly highlight what I think is the importance of talking about scale, both the time scale and the spatial scale. And I really find this important, I guess, because when we're thinking about integration, when we're thinking about a system, we've got to figure out what the scale and what the scope and what the boundaries are of the system that we're talking about, and to look at the multiple levels that we're dealing with as well. So I find that often we use the term system in a kind of generic sense that isn't as precise as perhaps we should be. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of maps here. This is the Northwest Atlantic. There is a very great spot, Halifax. Please come visit. Here is just to highlight the Gulf of Maine area, and I'm going to narrow in on the Gulf of Maine. Here's the Bay of Fundy part of the Gulf of Maine, and I'll narrow in there. And now there's a tiny little body of water called the Annapolis Basin. That is where that A is highlighted there. Right? That's the Annapolis Basin. A little part of Nova Scotia that's sea water. It's part of the Northwest Atlantic Ocean, but very small area compared with that Northwest Atlantic. But, you know, it's amazing what's going on in that small body of water. So the point is we can talk about large marine ecosystems as our scale. We can talk about the Annapolis Basin here as the scale of discussion of everything from an integrated ecosystem assessment through to integrated management of the various uses that you can see there, and the various damages like sewage spills that occur occasionally when it rains heavily. So we've got these different scales that we're dealing with, and we need to decide what it is we're talking about. If you're dedicated to a focus on the 4X haddock fishery in southwest Nova Scotia, if that's your thing, then you know what scale you're talking about. But when we're talking about systems generally, that can vary. That can be the Bay of Biscay off the coast here. That can be the Antarctic Ocean. So such a wide range to deal with. And that brings me to governance, a term that wasn't big in the marine side of things even maybe 10 years ago, but is now the jargon term that we all seem to feel that we have to use. But for 100 years, we've been talking about management of the ocean, management of ocean uses, management of fisheries, and so on, that basically includes everything that we now refer to as governance. But this has become a common term. And one particular aspect that I think governance, because governance is just about decision-making, and who's doing the decision-making and what lies behind the decision-making, it does highlight one particular idea of values. And I had the opportunity to work with a number of fisher and ocean use organizations over the years that have, in terms of scale, right from the Annapolis Basin area of Nova Scotia through to the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers that has helped forge the small-scale fishery guidelines of the world, the recent development through the FAO. Discussion of values, and this relates very closely to the ethics aspect that's been referred to earlier. We often forget about values, and that's something that we need to add into the discussion. People's values differ, of course. That leads to conflict, but underlying that conflict is often the values aspect. Sustainability, different aspects of sustainability. I have a tendency to want to look at community sustainability, like coastal community sustainability, in addition to the normal aspects of ecological, social, economic, and institutional. Integrative frameworks for governance. We can talk about ecosystem-based management, integrated management, sustainable livelihoods approach was mentioned, I think, by Eddie Ellison. So we have these various integrative frameworks that we can draw on for insights. And then we have multi-sectoral ideas of how do we pull things together. This was from some joint work with Patrick McConney in Barbados, looking at the Caribbean marine social ecological system and all the interactions that one can look at there. Now, when we talk about integration in terms of governance, we can look at, and again, this is a fishery-focused one, but we can look at the broadening that's taken place on the science side into ecosystem-based management. And that has come from the science angle, even though ecosystem-based management, of course, is just as much a human topic as it is a ecological one. But in terms of building in the social science, for me, the equivalent of broadening to looking at ecosystem from looking at single species is to broaden to look at coastal areas and ocean users. So to link in the human side, the human environment, coastal communities, coastal regions, into the analysis. And that leads to participation, the question of participation. What I like to think of as a triangle of co-management that has varying degrees of involvement of government, community, and fisher in this case, or ocean users. So co-management, of course, is just as applicable to the multi-sectoral world as it is to one sector, although we've tended to have it develop more in terms of forest management and wildlife management, fishery management, and so on. On the line of participation, there's a whole field that's been raised by several different speakers in this meeting of community-based management or community participation. So I like to highlight the difference between the community and the ocean users. They are two different entities, but obviously related. So the ocean users live in coastal communities, but the community is a collective, a place-based collective. The fishers or ocean users, if they are gathered together in associations, are sector-based collectives in that sense. So whether we organize the governance by place or by sector is, for me, a big question. There's no right answer. It depends on what the problem is that we're addressing. Serge Garcia and perhaps Jake Rice, two of my co-authors on this book on governance linking marine fisheries and biodiversity conservation, we've referred to the different streams of governance, and in particular I want to just highlight the aspect that whatever the stream of governance that we're talking about, the realm of decision making, we want to ask in terms of sustainability, how are we balancing the different pillars of sustainability? We found in our work on this book that the social aspects tended to be downplayed, received less attention relative to the economic and ecological aspects of sustainability. So, interesting hypothesis, something that you could test in looking at the real world, other specific situations. Now, in terms of human involvement in ocean use, it seems to me, and this is from a paper with Liz Wilson from a few years ago, looking particularly at human dimensions of marine protected areas, it seems to me that there are several ingredients that we need to be taking into account. And we suggested there were 10 in particular, but I'm sure, frankly, that there are others that you could probably name. Factors that need to be looked at, not just with marine protected areas, but with dealing with oceans more broadly. And I won't go through each of these, but you're welcome to check with me on them or read the paper, of course. But there are some aspects. Participation, for example, is not just sending a note around to ocean users. It's making that participation meaningful. That's the challenge. The rights refer to both use rights, the rights to use the ocean, and also more and more these days human rights, and link, because there's been a United Nations initiative to link together resource access with human rights issues. So, and that was again referred to somewhat by Eddie Elson. So there's a whole range of people factors for success that I think we can draw on from a lot of experience, again, not just with MPAs, but with a whole range of ocean uses. But there are also challenges, of course, with governance. And I mentioned earlier the issues of boundaries, scope, and scale. Certainly the difference between ecological and human boundaries is one of those that we mention. If somebody's talking about a challenge, they'll say, well, you have to figure out this aspect of ecological and human boundaries. But in fact, we don't really know how to deal with that. They're so entrenched. I mean, ecosystem boundaries are there out in nature, and human boundaries are, like political boundaries, are pretty much part of nature as well. They're not easily changed. So we face that conundrum all the time. Connecting with political and institutional realities, creating appropriate incentives, fitting to the right scale of the system, and making governance both participatory and adaptive. I mean, for me, these are some of the big challenges. And we've been working, some of us have been working on looking at the management aspect of climate adaptation around the world, and have looked at some of the ingredients that are used in terms of styles of adaptation, from soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure through social planning, technology, and capacity efforts to build climate adaptation. And so this particular diagram shows the mix based on a literature survey. So this is just based on publications that we could locate, the mix of these different adaptation strategies that are used in various countries of the world where we found data. This is not published yet, but it's soon to come out. Okay, I want to jump to a few particular topic areas: ecosystem-based management, integrated ocean management, and integrated assessments. So some years ago, about 10 years ago now actually, well, 8 years ago, with Cassandra de Young at FAO, we published a FAO technical paper on the human dimensions of the ecosystem approach, specifically on fisheries at that point. Since then, by the way, I've published a similar article in an edition of The Sea, edited by Mike Fogarty in the US, on human dimensions of marine ecosystem-based management. That came out a year or so ago. And then subsequently, working with a graduate student, Rachel Long in Canada, we looked at some of the underlying key principles of ecosystem-based management. We were thinking of it in terms of fisheries and oceans, but we looked more broadly. And if there's a table that anybody shows in a PowerPoint that is illegible, this is probably it. But let me just sum up here that basically what we did is look at a series of publications that seemed to be significantly referenced in the world, and we basically asked what principles, these are papers or reports dealing with ecosystem-based management, what principles do they highlight? And those tick marks there are reflecting those. So the ones that stood out as most prominent are on the right-hand side of this diagram, such as considering ecosystem connections. Perhaps that's not surprising. It's ecosystem-based management, adaptive management, appropriate spatial and temporal scales. There's that scale aspect coming in again. Use of scientific knowledge, stakeholder involvement, and so on down. Now, that doesn't mean that acknowledging uncertainty is some way at the low level. These are just the top few. So these were the prominent principles that came out of our analysis. Soon to be published in the journal Fish and Fisheries is a subsequent analysis we did looking at how fishermen think of ecosystem-based management relative to this previous analysis of how the literature, the publications look at ecosystem-based management. And I should have mentioned here that the student Rachel Long was co-supervised with Rob Stevenson and myself. Well done, Rob. So we're looking forward to getting this piece of work out that really, in a sense, delves into how to improve the participation of stakeholders or of ocean users by recognizing the difference in values, but also the difference in perceptions of what's important. Looking at the local level, and again, scale is important, and I have found that I have a particular passion, as I might have alluded to earlier, to looking at the local level and particular coastal communities, how communities can engage in ocean conservation and ocean management. There's a particular report you might find interesting if you haven't seen it, a community-based ecosystem approach to fisheries management from Pacific Island countries. Very nice effort, perhaps the first I've ever seen, to apply EBM at a local level. In Nova Scotia, we've done some research looking at a particular community called Port Mattoon. That might look like Mouton to some of you, but there's a history behind why it's now Mattoon. Anyway, so this is a spot in southwest Nova Scotia where we were looking at ecosystem services. This is particularly colleague Laura Laux, her work, that tried to look at ecosystem services from an unusual perspective by asking people about ecosystem services, asking people in particular, in this case, about the loss of ecosystem services. And this was a particular issue around finfish farming and fishing. So this table shows the losses that the fishing people experienced or perceived from the existence of a finfish farm in this bay, and there's issues with lack of flushing and so on. So what this shows, for example, is that that roughly, somewhat over half generally saw a loss in various ingredients like the catch of lobsters, mackerel fishing, and so on, loss of provision of seafood in different ways, and economic loss to livelihoods from fouling of gear or increased bait costs that come from, a lack of bait, which they blame on the fish farm. So again, this is perceptions, but we've related it back to ecosystem services. I want to jump to work that I did a few years ago with, or for OECD, and it was relating to, some of you might know OECD has a fisheries unit that was interested in looking at integrated ocean management. And so my task was to look at how the idea of integrated management, or let's say multi-sectoral management, linked to fisheries in particular. So in particular, the idea of the integration involves multi-sectoral, multi-objective, ecosystem-based management with spatial allocation, conflict resolution, new governance structures to make that possible, and a diverse toolkit. Certainly, EBM and integrated management, and interesting discussions I've had at this meeting about the downfall or the downturn of popularity of integrated management as a terminology, and yet the rise of an understanding of the need to look multi-sectorally and in terms of multiple objectives. Integrated management has been tried over the past 20 years and has had mixed success, shall we say. So some would say now that ecosystem-based management is the jargon, the term that has more popularity. But they both seek an integrated, holistic approach to management of human uses. I would argue that integrated management takes a more organizational approach, and EBM comes from a systems background. But fundamentally, they are both morphing into pretty much the same idea of multi-sectoral, multi-objective, integrated, holistic management of human ocean uses. There's many instruments, and indeed marine spatial planning is one that's become very popular to talk about integrated management. In fact, the Convention on Biological Diversity this autumn is I imagine, going to pass, because their scientific and technical committee has just passed a new approach that's focused on what they're referring to as marine spatial planning, but essentially the idea of marine spatial planning is connected with ocean zoning. And then the need for new institutions is one of the key elements in this integration. I think I'll skip over this, but I was looking in this OECD study at some of the benefits and costs to the fishery sector from moving into a multi-sectoral way of thinking. And I guess I'll just mention, as a somewhat economist, that looking at benefits and costs both together is really crucial in this realm. So often we hear about the benefits of this or the benefits of that, but certainly there are costs in terms of potentially lost resources, higher management costs, and compromises that might be needed. I'll skip this, but just a couple. There's certainly win-win illustrations of how integrated management and fisheries can connect together. But basically, for me, the key with integrated management is to be thinking, and as a researcher, trying to figure out the links of integrated management with single sector management. I mean, that's both a political kind of question and a research question, and the changes needed in the governance structures to become suitably efficient in how we are doing that management decision making. And once again, and this is a recurring theme here, the need to look at multiple scales and to look at the people side of things. Now, I want to turn to integrated assessments. This was a survey that I did for Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans several years ago, looking at social, economic, and cultural analysis. So this is the assessment aspect, and perhaps some of you dealing with integrated ecosystem assessments might find this of some interest. So we were not looking at the ecosystem per se. We were looking at the social, economic, and cultural aspects in the context of integrated management or large ocean management areas, or you could say EBM. So we looked at a number of case studies at different scales. At the small local scale, like Montego Bay, Jamaica, at medium scale and large scale areas, and then multi-country large scale areas like the Baltic Sea. And so our survey was trying to figure out what kinds of information, social, cultural, economic information, had been gathered together to do these assessments. So that was basically the question. And our advice, or the advice we were asked to give to Canadian DFO, was what's the norm, what's normal in terms of the kinds of advice that would be given. And so we looked at the kind of variables or indicators that were being analyzed and collected, and that depended on the setting, of course. We looked at the different attributes, process, content, and the kind of data forms that we're dealing with, and marked that in terms of the different management areas that were being looked at. And our conclusions, this is just a few of the conclusions I wanted to highlight here, were not surprisingly that there's a key role of local conditions. That doesn't really tell us anything, because the bigger picture is that capacity, budgets, time available, and goals were essential in terms of what kinds of information were actually available for these couple of dozen cases that we examined. The scales range from small to large. The socio-economic assessments we found were mostly economic. Now, this study was entirely separate from the work that Serge, Jake, and I had done with that book, where we found that in governance, the social aspects were not paid as much attention to as the economic and ecological aspects. Here, in terms of the assessment effort, we were finding that the social aspects were not as much attended to as the economic. The cultural assessments, when they were done, were largely for the local cases and not for the larger scale cases. The studies we looked at were finding that the governance aspects were crucial, and basically in terms of the timing, and this maybe is pretty obvious, that the best successes were when the evaluation phase was early in the whole process, rather than waiting to the end to see how it all turned out. So that was just the analysis from looking at a couple of dozen cases. Indicators, it's dangerous in this audience to talk about indicators because, you know, it might be an index, but I think these are indicators. So I'm going to continue on with a set of indicators that, so I find indicators, frameworks, integrated frameworks of indicators fascinating to try to figure out. And led by Rob Stevenson in Canada, we've just, through the Canadian Fishery Research Network, tried to develop a set of indicators that could actually be applied by the Canadian government and by others, and certainly in many other countries. Australia is a good example. Sets of indicators have been at the forefront. This is a study from several years ago in the early 2000s that tried to look in an integrated way at a range of indicators in my home area of Nova Scotia, Canada, with a whole bunch of possible indicators. And what I want to highlight here is that although I've labeled them economic, there are some here like depreciation in natural capital and the value of ecosystem services that are really more what I would call ecological, economic, and certainly more modern, less conventional measures compared with, let's say, total landed value and the value of exports, although those are still very popular. I also want to highlight institutional indicators. Perhaps some of you have worked with institutional indicators. They're tough to figure out. but I think they're often neglected and deserve more attention. Working with a graduate student, Heather Boyd, we looked at, again, at the local level of indicators, community-based indicators, and this was particularly for fisheries, again, but trying to look at a framework for how to develop indicators, and then basically do, for a particular case in Nova Scotia, a look at how indicators, a set of indicators turned out from a point of view, and again, these were broken down into community sustainability, ecological, institutional, and socioeconomic sustainability indicators. And we basically looked at how many of those were theoretically, so this is from a large macro set that Heather compiled from the literature, a macro set of possible indicators. How many were theoretically appropriate at a local level, practical, with data available, and therefore, if you had all three of these, usable indicators. So this was finding then, so you can see in terms of what satisfies all of these three criteria of being theoretically appropriate, practical, and with data available, the scores on the right-hand side are fairly low. And in fact, they're low for all of the categories of community, ecological, institutional, and socioeconomic, even though overall, most of the indicators were theoretically appropriate. There was a fair number that were also practical in terms of implementation. The big problem came with data availability. So our message coming out of this particular work was that if you believe in there being multiple scales that we look at things at in the ocean, then perhaps the local scale needs to be paid attention to in terms of data availability and the need to improve that availability. Okay, I want to basically close now with a couple of examples that are trying to look at, well, you can see people in places. So, you know, I have just such a, well, I hope not naive, but certainly optimistic belief in people. And, okay, sometimes it's a little naive, but broadly, a kind of upbeat belief in people and in communities and in collective action. So yesterday, and previously, you've heard a couple times about Elinor Ostrom. People talk about her partly because she won a Nobel Prize, which is kind of cool, especially for a political scientist winning an economics Nobel Prize. And especially for somebody who is dedicated to looking at local communities and what they were accomplishing. Well, I find that, you know, inspiring. As a researcher, I find it inspiring what she worked on, and I've kind of followed along in that stream of things. But I want to highlight something. She didn't do that work. No, let me rephrase that. She did her own work herself, yes, but she wasn't the person in those communities who was figuring out how to manage the ocean and manage the resources sustainably. That was people all around the world in thousands of locations who have figured this out themselves, who have used their local knowledge and pulled it together to figure out how to conserve the ocean and at the same time make a living. Sustainable livelihoods would be the terminology there. So what she did was to highlight and analyze what led to success in some of these cases. Now again, I don't want to be naive. It's not like every case is a glorious success. But when you look at the successes, you get inspired and you try to figure out, why are they successful? So that's some effort that I'm working with dozens of colleagues around the world in something called the Community Conservation Research Network that's basically trying to look at success in community environmental stewardship linked to sustainable livelihoods and also linked to government support. So we're looking at many different spots around the world, and I won't go into that too much, but last year we pulled together some preliminary messages. And the two I want to highlight there are the first two. Well, first three. Community conservation is essential to livelihoods and economies. Involving local communities leads to better results. And the third one is the flip side of that. Excluding communities can lead to conflict and management failure. If you'd like to explore more, communityconservation.net's the spot for that. But I want to really finish with just two of these locations. One that my colleague Rob Stevenson is rather fond of, the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and I want to highlight these two spots. They're both Canadian, sorry about that, but two spots I have a particular passion for. The Bay of Fundy is a wonderful location. Tides go up and down, you know. They've just announced that in-stream tidal turbines are going to be installed there, which I gather there are similar turbines in the ocean not too far from here on I think the north coast of France, perhaps. But we got the highest tides in the world, so we're going to win. Bay of Fundy, wonderful spot. People like Greg Thompson out fishing in the Bay of Fundy. You know, to fish when the tides are so high like that, you really need a knack. You've got to know your environment. And people like Greg have spent a good part of his career building up fisher organizations and doing stuff that makes the fishery more sustainable. The Bear River First Nation indigenous community, also on the Bay of Fundy, actually in that Annapolis Basin area, working to restore the streams, get the fish back in their local streams, and basically combine, again, the conservation effort with livelihoods. Meanwhile, in the middle of the Bay of Fundy, the North Atlantic right whale, one of the more endangered whales around, well, success in changing the shipping lanes. This is not a community-based effort. This was a big international effort. But it's amazing what people can do when they've got that passion for conservation and livelihoods together. On the other side of Canada, the Nachalnith people, indigenous people on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Lovely spot there with good surfing if you're into that. You might like to visit. The Nachalnith people have an organization called Uathluk that translates as taking care of whatever that they're dealing with. And they work with two basic principles, well, several principles, but two in particular. The Hishukish Shwalk, which is everything is one, everything is connected. This is a principle that's been around before ecosystem-based management terminology came. And Isak, which means respect or caring for everyone and everything. You can learn a lot from local people in different parts of the world, and I certainly have. And it's given me this passion for the idea that the solutions are there, that we need to give support to those solutions and tap into giving support to the people. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention.